The story of Shem, Ham, and Japheth is a short anecdotal story, but with far-reaching consequences. We'll begin by delineating the boundaries of the short story. So the story clearly begins in chapter 9 of Genesis, after Noah has exited the ark and there is the covenant of the rainbow. We have an opening. In verse 18, the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Ham being the father of Canaan. So that's clearly an opening. We have the introduction of the names of the sons of Noah, including his grandson, Canaan. And that's the clear opening of the story. Its conclusion we find in the end of the chapter, right, with a clear summary, right? And all the days of Noah came to 950 years, then he died. So very fitting conclusion, the death of Noah. That's in verse 29, the last verse of chapter 9. And chapter 10 has a new opening, the classic opening we find in the book of Genesis. Ve'ele toldot b'nei Noach. These are the lines, the lineages of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So that's a genealogical list. So the boundary is clear. We found the conclusion in verse 29 and the opening of the story in verse 18. Okay, so we'll begin by analyzing. As we read, the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth in English, Japheth in Hebrew. Ham being the father of Canaan. So here the narrator also gives us another piece of important information, informing us that Canaan is the son of Ham. This will be important for the continuation, as we'll find out shortly. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole world branched out. So basically we have a very ceremonial kind of opening here, a double mentioning that these are the sons of Noah, and an explicit statement emphasizing that they are pretty much the fathers of the new world, the post-diluvial, post-flood world. Verse 2, the action begins after the prologue. Noah, the tiller of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. So here we have a description of Noah as a Ish ha'adama in the Hebrew. Ish ha'adama, translated tiller of the soil. Now, this is not the first time that we have Noah being described. He was described in the beginning of the flood story. Noah ish tzaddik tamim haya bedorotav, right? He was a righteous man in his generation. That's how he's described in the opening of the flood narrative in chapter 6. And now we compare, we have a different description, not ish tzaddik tamim, a completely righteous man, but rather ish hadama, a man of the soil, if we take it literally, right? A man of the ground, ish hadama. What's the significance of this description, Ish ha'adama, tiller of the soil? Well, it's obviously to give us the background that he is here as a farmer, as one who works in agriculture. And this will immediately connect with the continuation of the verse, that he began and planted a vineyard. But I believe that beyond that description, there may be some implied kind of hint towards a deterioration of Noah if he's originally described as a totally righteous man in the beginning of the flood story. Now he's described as a man of the earth, Ish ha'adama. And that may be a foreshadowing of a certain deterioration in the status of Noah, perhaps not necessarily remaining the totally righteous person that we were introduced to in the beginning of the flood story. In any event, Noah here is, as a farmer, planting, and he plants a vineyard. And not only does he plant a vineyard, we're later informed, probably took a while, but in the following verse in 21, he drank of the wine and became drunk, and he uncovered himself within his tent. So we also have a description of Noach getting drunk after planting the vineyard. So we'll begin with the action of planting, the continuation of the agricultural tradition that we saw earlier on in Genesis with Cain, who was a farmer, and here it continues later on with Noach planting a vineyard. A couple of interesting points. This is the first mention of wine in the Bible. As far as biblical attitude towards wine in general, well, it seems to be somewhat ambivalent. On the one hand, wine is described as making people happy. Yain yisamach levav enosh. It will make man's heart happy. On the other hand, we have descriptions of drunkenness, that's connected to improprious behavior, including lewdness, etc. So there's kind of like a mixed attitude in general. Of course, in humanity, there are different approaches. Some religions, Islam, of course, forbids alcohol. And we also know in certain other cultures, there's definitely ambivalence with regard to alcohol. In America, there was a period of prohibition, right, from the years 1920, I believe, to 1933. There was a period that alcohol was prohibited. So that was one of the manners in which certain cultures tried to grapple with the problem of alcohol, which of course goes along with drunkenness, and often is combined with violence or sexual impropriety. So that's an attitude here. We got a picture of coming from the period of the prohibition, where you see the policemen overseeing the removal of liquor during the prohibition period. So that's one approach. Judaism has an interesting approach because it actually uplifts wine. It's the only drink that has a special blessing. All blessings on drink are the general, generic, shehakol niya bidvaro, that everything came into existence by his speech, by his creation. But when you drink wine, there's a special blessing of the creator of the fruit of the vine, Borei Pri Hagafen. So it has special status. It's used in many religious important ceremonies, including the ceremony of circumcision and marriage. So it's an elevated drink with a special blessing that sets it apart from all drinks, and connected to holiness and the worship, the sacrificial worship in the temple, where sacrifices were also included libations of wine. So I think Judaism has a special attitude. It doesn't go in the direction of, let's say, Islam, of totally prohibiting, or the direction of American culture at a certain point, which tried to prohibit liquor in general. It allows it, but actually elevates it and puts it in the category of something that's related to holiness. And I think that may be one of the reasons why perhaps alcoholism is less prominent and doesn't plague Jewish culture as much as it does in other cultures, because children grow up with wine on the table, and Sabbath, of course, sanctifying the Sabbath, the Kiddush, right? So they're used to it. It's not something that's prohibited and therefore attractive, but it's in a controlled, elevated, holy manner. And Judaism often finds positive things, even though they have certain potential for negative effect. It grapples with it not by prohibiting it, but rather by sanctifying, uplifting, and finding its usage in its proper setting. But in any event, it's fully aware of the dangers of alcohol. And here we have the first example where Noach drinks from the wine and he becomes drunk, and he's naked in his tent. the term in Hebrew for translated uncovered is vayitgal, right? Is a verb that's common in describing sexual sins, gilui arayot, right? Incest has the same root to uncover. So here, Noach is uncovered naked in his tent, vayitgal betoch ohalo. Another interesting aspect in relation to the wine is geographic. According to historians, right, it's a very interesting area in history. There's the history of foods, right? Different foods, where do they originate from? So with regard to wine, it's quite clear that wine and the cultivation of wild grapes developed in the Caucasus, and particularly development of wine in a wide-scale manner emanated in the area of Armenia. We can see certain headings in the news. CNN: scientists discovered oldest winery in Armenian cave. Here you can see the opening. Forget France. It turns out the real birthplace of wine may be in a cave in Armenia. Similarly, in the Decanter magazine, specializing in wine, so we see a similar opening. Armenian find is world's oldest winery, and here you can see pictures of the archaeological finds. So historians say that in the area of the Caucasus, Georgia, and so forth, the vineyards began being cultivated by humans, and wine became more widespread in the area of Armenia. Why do I state that? Well, if we go back for a second to the story of the flood, we recall, where did the ark basically land when the water began to subside? Where did it reach land? Well, let's return to the description. In Genesis 8, verse 4, it states, so that in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Why is that interesting? Well, Mount Ararat is an impressive mountain, right, reaching beyond 5,000 meters, right? And it was a volcanic mountain, previously, right, active, now fortunately inactive. But where is it located? So let's take a look for a second in the map here. I've got it listed for you. You can see it's in the most eastern tip of Turkey, present-day Turkey, on the border with Armenia. In fact, our Armenians still view it as part of their culture, Mount Ararat, and irredentists want to return the mountain into their geography, into their lands, but it's clearly connected to that area of Armenia. We see the Caucasus between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. This is the area of the birth of cultivation, human cultivation of grapes, and the development of wine. Because as we can see, we're talking a very ancient development going back, right, many thousands of years into the 5th century BCE, where we have widespread production of wine. So that's interesting, because according to the story, that's exactly where Noach finds himself, in Mount Ararat, in the border of Armenia, and that's where historians say wine developed, and that's what the story recounts, that Noach was part of that development in planting, cultivating wine, grapes, and cultivating wine. So geographically, this is something which is very in tandem with what historians say happened as far as the spread of wine. Another interesting point with regard to wine is the language, the word. If you look in different languages and cultures, there seems to be a relationship in the term used. So in Hebrew, we say yayin, which of course is very similar to the word wine. Wine, yain. In other languages, we have, for example, in Italian or Latin languages, in Russian, vino, in French, vin. It's all apparently related, right? Yain, yud nun, wine, vino, right? Vin. which is also with an N at the end. All these seem to emanate from the same root, and that's not surprising because if indeed wine emanates from the area of the Caucasus, well, that's a very central area. It's not surprising that with its spread, the term used was common in different areas, including in some areas in the Semitic languages of the Middle East, right, and in Europe, right, and in Russia, because of such a central location in the ancient world. The language, even the term, all right, may have been kept as it spread from such a central place in the area, the Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia. Okay, so we return to our verses, and we see that Noach indeed deteriorates and gets drunk. We ask, what happened to Noach? And perhaps here we have, from a psychological perspective, we can understand Noach just came out of the ark, and he, even though he was saved, he experienced a very difficult, traumatic experience, basically witnessing the destruction of the world, everything that he knew, all his neighbors, right, the whole world that he was familiar with, eradicated, right? And of course, such a traumatic event is not easy to cope with. And as we know, a lot of times, how do people cope with trauma? Often by escapism. And one of the easy ways to escape is, of course, via the red wine and alcohol. So maybe that's part of what's going on here with Noach Ish Ha'adama, not only literally the farmer, the tiller of the soil, but a person who is connected to the world and also feels the pain and difficulty having witnessed its destruction. So he's drunk, naked, right, in his tent. We continue reading. Ham, sometimes pronounced in English, Ham, right? Ham, the father of Canaan, once again, the mention of Canaan, as we saw in the prologue, right? The relation to Canaan. So Ham, one of the sons of Noach, who was the father of Canaan, the grandson of Noach, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers outside. So Ham witnesses the state of his father Noach, that he's naked, right, in the tent, and he recounts this to his other brothers. And then in the following verse 23, we have the description of their reaction. And it's interesting because the translation translates but in the opening of the verse, which I believe is correct, even though the Hebrew is vaikach, which literally usually would be translated and he took, or they took, right? But here the translator, I think correctly, uses the word but. Shem and Japheth took a cloth, right? Because as we shall see, this seems to be a contrast, a purposeful contrast with the previous verse. So Shem and Japheth took a cloth, or if we would literally translate it, but Shem took with Japheth, okay? But the translation here is, but Shem and Japheth took a cloth, placed it against both their backs, and walking backward, they covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned the other way so that they did not see their father's nakedness. So here we have a description of the two brothers basically taking a cloth, spreading it on their shoulders, on their backs, going backwards so as not to see their father in that state, and then basically covering their father. Okay, kind of a simple description here of the responses of the sons, the three sons. First, Ham informing his brothers, and then the two brothers taking care to cover their father. Seemingly not so eventful description, But as we shall see, this is taken very severely by the biblical narrative. There's a sin in this description. When Noah woke up from his wine and learned what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." So we see that this is viewed, this action is viewed as a very severe action. Okay? Now, the first question, and perhaps most central question that we have to ask here is, what is so severe that Noah wakes up from his wine after his hangover and he knows what happened, right? What his youngest son had done to him, and then he responds by cursing Canaan, the son of Ham. What's so severe? Ham walked into the tent, saw his father naked, then decided to walk out and inform his brothers, and they help and take care of the situation. And indeed, I'd say this is the most central question that has to be grappled with in this narrative. What's the big deal? What's so horrible? In fact, many commentators, both ancient commentators and modern commentators, believe that the story is hiding and not revealing the whole event and just hinting towards something that happened, right? It's not only that Ham walked in and saw his father's nakedness, but there was something else that happened here, right? We can see the debate amongst the ancient Jewish scholars, right, in the Talmud, where they debate what happened. Here we see in the Babylonian Talmud, in the tractate of Sanhedrin, it's called, a disagreement amongst two early commentators, the earliest rabbis of the Amoraim, the second stage, not the scholars, the sages of the Mishnah, who are called Tanaim, but the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, right, are in a disagreement about what exactly happened. And see the two opinions. Rav and Shmuel, two of the important first generation Amoraim, disagreed. What happened right after the description of the verse of Noah waking up and cursing? So they asked, what happened? What's the big deal? So one says that Ham castrated Noah, and one says that Ham sodomized him. So obviously an act was performed here according to the early sages, right? And two options are raised, which are quite striking and extreme, right? And by the way, some modern commentators also agree with this general line of direction that there's a very severe sin here performed, and simply the Torah did not want to explicitly state it and reveal it, but hints towards it. And here the rabbis are in disagreement, right? Option number one between the two great sages is that Ham castrated Noah. Why would he do such a thing? So the sages continue on explaining he didn't want Noah to have an additional son. Out of greed, he said, let there only be 3 sons and no more, so that we get a greater inheritance. So he decides to castrate him. Right? Well, if that's the case, we can understand how when Noah wakes up, he realizes something was done. The second option was not that he castrated him, but he sodomized him, namely had sexual relations with him. And of course, from the biblical perspective, that would entail 2 sins, both incest relations, sexual relations between father and son, and also homosexuality, which is prohibited by the Torah. So that would be a double sin. Both in any event would be viewed as being very severe. And if that's the case, then we can understand the follow-up and response of a long-reaching curse as a consequence of this action. And like I said, this is also accepted by some scholars, modern scholars. However, I don't think that this is an approach that could be accepted in the pshat. If we want to build off what is stated, I can understand why the midrash, the homiletical interpretation, takes in a very negative direction. In fact, the description of castration may actually be a form of hidden critique as to what was accustomed in other cultures. We know definitely in the Persian Empire, this was the case. There were many slaves that were castrated. By the way, this custom continued on into Roman civilization, all right, and only at a later stage in the Roman Empire was it prohibited, but slaves were often castrated, sometimes put as guards over the harems of the kings, guarding the king's wives. So this is kind of a reflection of maybe some of what was found in cultures surrounding ancient Judaic culture. Not only castration, also, of course, homosexual relations, and in general, sexual impropriety from the biblical perspective. We know this is something that was very common. For example, in Greek Hellenistic culture, homosexuality was very rampant and widespread, to the point where we have a description where Greek women who tried to find favor and get attraction, attract the eyes of other men, would actually dress up as men, right? To that extreme was the situation. And we know of sexual culture in, for example, later Roman civilization, Pompeii, and what it was known for as far as its sexual lewdness and behavior. So what I'm hinting at is that maybe the sages here actually are trying to critique their surrounding culture, Roman Hellenistic culture and their norms, by saying that, oh, these our own rulers, those who conquered the land of Israel, well, they think they're conquerors, but their behavior is very much one of that's similar to Ham, the one whose descendants were cursed to be slaves. Right? And this could be just a statement in the manner in which these sages critique their surrounding cultures. But if we return to the actual description, I believe that a simple reading of the text can lead to a different conclusion. And I believe the key to unraveling what is so severe in what happened here, with Ham entering the tent, seeing the father's nakedness, and recounting this to his brothers, this could be picked up on and unraveled via paying attention to the language used and certain contrasts in language that could be seen in the comparison of verses 21 and 22. Because in the description of Noah getting drunk, in verse 21, he drank of the wine and became drunk, and he uncovered himself. There's a lengthier description within his tent, right? In Hebrew, Vaitgal betoch ohalo, which could have been described succinctly just with one letter, be'ohalo. You don't need that additional, the extended word, betoch ohalo. It's be'ohalo would be sufficient, but nevertheless, the narration uses that lengthy language, that word. I believe that is used in order to contrast with the following verse, because the following verse says, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers, outside, in Hebrew, bachutz. Now, outside, of course, is the contrast of within, right? Both words are quite superfluous. Like I said, it would have been sufficient just in the Hebrew to say be'ohalo, not betoch. And the description of his two brothers, bachutz, outside, obviously his brothers are not there, right? If they were, they would have been seeing what he saw, but they're outside. So it's kind of superfluous to mention that. But nevertheless, the Torah goes out of its way to emphasize bachutz, outside. And I believe this contrast between within and outside in the two verses, right, it directs us towards the understanding of what's so severe here. The Torah emphasized that what happened, even though very embarrassing, right, and perhaps showing a deterioration in the status of Noach, but nevertheless, it happens privately, right, within his tent. Now, what does Ham do? What happened previously, the faux pas, the embarrassing situation is publicized, right? He told his two brothers outside, as if bringing out all the dirty laundry, right, before everyone. Now, everyone, that's the whole world in those times, before all the other brothers, right? So that I believe that on the simple reading of the text, the sin here is one of embarrassing his father, right? What would be called in Hebrew lashon hara, bringing very negative and critical words publicly, right, to the public knowledge of others, right, and this in general, speaking negatively of your fellow human being is publicly is considered a severe sin. Now, in this instance, it's not just anyone; it's your father, right? And we know, of course, how important respect of parents is in the Bible. Later on, we'll find itself as one of the 10 Commandments, so that Ham is not only not fulfilling respect your father and mother, but he is totally embarrassing and publicly demeaning his father. And hence, this is indeed viewed as something extremely negative. And that is, I believe, the reason why there's such a severe reaction. Now, the following verse describes Shem and Japheth's actions, and they're also, I think, purposefully aimed at creating a contrast with the action of Ham. And I believe you can find two contrasts in what Shem and Japheth do as opposed to Ham. Verse 23 emphasizes twice, right, that Shem and Japheth took a cloth, right, put on their backs, and walking backwards, they covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned the other way so that they did not see their father's nakedness, right? So their faces were turned away, and they did not see. Now, the description of not seeing, right, turning the other way and not seeing is, of course, the contrast of what we find with regard to Ham. He saw his father's nakedness, and the text wants to emphasize they did not, even though they heard of what's happening, they did not want to see it, right? They found it to be something which would demean their father, and therefore they set their backs, right, not wanting to look. So that's one contrast, not seeing as opposed to seeing, and it's purposefully not seeing, making an effort not to see. But it's not only that they make an effort not to see, whereas Ham saw. Could be that Ham mistakenly walked into the tent, didn't expect it, and saw it. But beyond that, what does Ham do? He tells his two brothers, right? Where does that find its contrast in the description of the acts of the other two brothers? Well, what do? Not only do they make sure not to see, right, both their backs and walking backwards, but they covered their father's nakedness. Now, of course, covering the nakedness of the father is exactly the opposite of publicizing, right, and making it known, further spreading, right? So we can see a double contrast between the actions of Shem and Japheth and the action of Ham, and the whole story seems to revolve around that contrasting between the two brothers as opposed to Ham's improprietous behavior. Okay, so it's now we've understood how severe this action is, even if we set aside what the sages and some other scholars say that the Torah is covering up and not really revealing what happened, and the sin is of course a very severe sin. Even if we take at face value that the sin is actually publicizing, right, the state of the embarrassing state of the father, this itself would be severe enough in biblical eyes, right? Okay, if there is clearly a sin here, so we expect, and we're used to it already within the book of Genesis, for a response, right? Many of the stories are organized according to the motif of crime and punishment, whether it be in the Garden of Eden, with Adam's sin, Adam and Eve's sin, or later on with Cain's sin. What we expect to find here is now punishment, and that we will indeed find. But what is surprising is who is the one to judge and punish? Because the continuation of the story, as we read, states when Noah woke up from his wine and learned what his youngest son had done to him, however, he knew it. Was he only partially drunk, not totally drunk, and at least was cognizant of what was happening, or he found out? In any event, he knows what happened, and then he judges. And he is the one who judges and says, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." Now, the fact that the punishment involves a curse is, of course, very much in line with what we found in Genesis, because that was the response in the two previous sins. God cursed the soil. Cursed be the soil, right? And it'll grow thorns and thistles. So it's the curse of the soil after the sin in the Garden of Eden. And we also had a curse of Cain by God, right? After he murdered Abel, where God says, "Arurata min ha'adama," cursed you be from the soil, or some interpret, you will be cursed beyond or more than the soil. In any event, all judgments involve a curse upon the sinner. So this is very much in line, continuing the motif that we find in Genesis. But what's different here is that is not the punishment, but the punisher. Who wages the punishment here? It is Noah. Noah woke up, and he's the one who curses Canaan. Why so? What's the nature of this difference? Well, the answer, I think, should be clear to those who read the previous chapter, or actually the beginning of chapter 9, the ramifications of the flood and some of the changes in the new world. Amongst the changes that God stated would characterize the new world is that God will look very stringently upon the spilling of human blood, but that includes the command in verse 6 in chapter 9 in Hebrew, "Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damoy shofech." Whoever sheds human blood, by human hands shall that one's blood be shed. We said that one of the differences in the new world following the flood is the laying of responsibility for judgment upon humans. Humans will have to judge murderers. Whoever sheds human blood, by human hands shall that one's blood be shed. For in the image of God was humankind made. So that in the new world, part of responsibility for judgment is shifted from God to humans. And look what happens exactly with the first sin described following the exit from the ark. It is indeed a human, Noah, who who punishes and lays the curse upon the perpetrator. So immediately following the change that was established by God in the New World of responsibility shifting to humans, this is exactly comes into play with the punishment which is waged by Noach himself, who is the one to curse the sinner. Or is that so? Did he curse the sinner? Let us look. Cursed in verse 25, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." Now, if we recall, who is the one who apparently sinned? Well, in verse 22, it was Ham. It just says that he's the father of Canaan, but Ham saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers outside. So it seems like Ham is the one who is responsible for what was done here. So then we ask, what happened with the punishment? Why is it Canaan, the son of Ham, who is cursed, and not Ham himself? It's a very intriguing question, right? And of course, this is a question that was raised by all commentators. Some modern commentators think that there was some manipulation or corruption of the text, and that originally the story had Ham being cursed, but it was changed to Canaan, and therefore some editor added the statements about Canaan. All speculation. Question is, can we grapple with the text as it is and try to explain why it is that Noach curses Canaan and not the perpetrator, Ham? Right. So, amongst the sages, we find the following approach. They indeed ask. This is in Breshit Rabbah, the famous midrashic compilation on the book of Genesis, Genesis Rabbah, chapter 36. So we read two possible explanations about why Ham why Canaan was cursed. So let's start up with Rabbi Nehemiah's explanation. First be Canaan. Rabbi Nehemiah explained it was Canaan who saw it, in other words, his father's nakedness in the first place, and informed them. Therefore, the curse is attached to him who did wrong. So what does Rabbi Nehemiah say? He says, well, in light of the punishment, we have to understand how things evolved here. It's not that Ham saw and recounted to his brothers. Rather, he says, it was maybe Canaan who saw first, and that's why Vayar Ham Avi Canaan, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness. So it could be that Canaan was the first to see. He recounted it to Ham, his father, and then Ham recounted it to his two brothers. And hence, this is like a snowball effect, but it all begins, according to this interpretation of Rabbi Nehemiah, with Canaan being the instigator, the first to see Noach's nakedness. Now that would be a perfect solution. Well, the only problem being that's not stated in the text. It's difficult to accept this as a simple reading because it adds things that are beyond the text. The text doesn't say that Canaan saw and told Ham. It says that Ham, the father of Canaan, saw and told his brothers. And the mention of him being the father of Canaan is, of course, to relate to Noach's reaction of cursing Canaan, but it doesn't imply that Canaan saw beforehand. But Rabbi Nehemiah was trying to figure out why curse Canaan if it was Ham who did the action. There's a different opinion raised by Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda offered the following explanation. He says, cursed be Canaan. Why so? Rabbi Yehuda said, since it is written, and God blessed Noach and his sons. Right? So Rabbi Yehuda finds the solution in the opening verse of chapter 9. Chapter 9 begins when Noach came out of the ark with the statement, that God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fertile, increase, and fill the earth." Now comes Rabbi Judah and says something very logical. He says, there cannot be a curse where a blessing has been given. Consequently, he said, "Cursed be Canaan." If God blessed Noah and his sons, that means that amongst those who were blessed was Ham, so that Noah finds himself in a situation where he cannot curse Ham. You can't curse he who has been blessed by God. So what is left for Noah to do? Well, he can only carry the punishment via the grandson, the son of Ham, right? And we have to assume maybe that Canaan was worthy of such a punishment, but this explains why Ham was not cursed, because he couldn't be cursed since he had already been blessed by God when they came out, because God blessed Noah and his sons. That includes Ham. So that maybe is a more convincing explanation by Rabbi Yehuda, who doesn't have to change the text, but rather builds off a text. I want to propose a second possible interpretation that I want to propose as being a possible pshat, a simple reading, in addition to what Rabbi Yehuda proposed. If we go back to our explanation of what was the sin, we suggested that the essence of the sin was the demeaning and disrespect shown by Ham to his father by publicizing, right, his embarrassing situation. So basically, the sin of Ham was showing disrespect and embarrassing his father. If so, we can say, I want to propose, that the punishment may be a measure for measure that reflects the sin. Ham, your sin was embarrassing publicly your father. Well, your punishment will be that you will have a son who will be cursed, who will be an embarrassment to you. So it could be that this is indeed a punishment of Ham, right? You will suffer the embarrassment of having a cursed son, where we have to once again assume that Canaan indeed is worthy of being punished. And I'll mention here, of course, Canaan is the forefather of many of the nations that were eventually conquered in the land of Canaan by the Israelites, right? And indeed, the introduction to all the laws of incest in the book of Leviticus states that you should not do the actions that were done in Canaan, not the actions that were done in Egypt, and not like the actions of Canaan. And then there's a list of all the prohibitions of incest that's found in Leviticus, I believe, chapter 18, the opening of the laws of incest. So that Canaan already is a negative figure, and here this story may be also giving us the background to his very negative character of his descendants, of the nations of Canaan, who were eventually the ones who were destroyed when the Israelites came out of Egypt into the land of Israel. So here we've offered several possible explanations to why in the story we read that Canaan was the one who was cursed by Noah and not Ham. Continue on in the narrative. After the curse, Noah continues in verse 26, and he said, "Blessed be Hashem," that's God, the God of Shem. "Let Canaan be a slave to them. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be a slave to them." So now Noah relates to the other two sons, but this time blesses them. The word Baruch is the blessing, right? Blessed, first relating to Shem, and then later relating to Japheth. So let's begin with the blessing of Shem, which is very intriguing. The blessing states, "Blessed be God, the God of Shem." right? Baruch Hashem Elohei Shem. And Canaan will be a slave to them, to him. Who's blessed here? Seems like God is blessed, right? Doesn't say may Shem be blessed by God, but blessed be Hashem, may blessed be God, the God of Shem. I believe that what's standing behind this blessing is indeed a blessing of Shem, via the statement that he is the God, that God is the God of Shem. In other words, Noach realizes that Shem's behavior may emanate, his positive behavior of covering up his father's nakedness, is something which stems from his relationship with God, and therefore he blesses God, the God of Shem. And the fact that God is called the God of Shem is indeed also a blessing to Shem, right? Emphasizing the closeness between God and Shem. And therefore, Canaan will be subservient to him and be a slave to him. So we had the curse that Canaan will be the lowest of slaves, and now in the blessing of Shem, that Canaan will be a slave to Shem and his descendants. And furthermore, we have Noach relating to Japheth, and he says here, may God enlarge Japheth. Now this, and you can only pick up on in the Hebrew, right? Enlarge is a translation of the word Yaft, which is a play on words on the name Yefet. Yaft Elohim leyefet. Yaft leyefet. Similar three letters, Yud Pei Taf, Yud Pei Taf, right? Yaft Elohim leyefet. May God enlarge, positively to Yefet, right? What does that mean? To enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. So it's interesting that the blessing here seems to state that Japheth will increase, will be large, maybe geographically, and he will dwell in the tents of Shem and let Canaan be a slave to them. Now, this blessing of Japheth actually connects nicely with the story. First of all, the blessing of Japheth says that you will also be in the tents of Shem. How is that to be taken and understood? Does it mean that Japheth will geographically dwell, right, and maybe conquer some of the lands of Shem? I don't think so. That's how it was understood by some commentators. I think it relates more in the direction of a cultural influence. To dwell in the tents of Shem is not only physically dwelling in the tents, but perhaps sharing, right, a similar culture with Shem. So there'll be closeness between Japheth and the descendants of Japheth and those of Shem, and Canaan will be a slave to them. So that's one aspect of them going together. And I believe another connection with the story itself is not only there having Shem and Japheth having been gone together and doing the positive act, but the positive act was actually performed where? In the tent, right? They came into the tent, right? They took a cloth, walked backwards, and then covered their father's nakedness, where their father's nakedness was in the tent, within his tent, right? And basically what they did is they covered up their father in the tent, right? The motif of the tent now is repeated also in the blessing of Japheth, where he will dwell in the tents of Shem, which may be also emphasizing their humility and their proper behavior towards their father, right, in the tent, right? And that's part of the blessing as well. So that's how Noach judges his sons, right? And if we summarize what happened here, and the next verses basically show that this is the conclusion of the extended story of Noach, including his sons, right? Noach lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noach came to 950 years. Then he died. This is the conclusion of the story. By the way, seemingly a banal conclusion. That's how people's lives conclude, with their death. But here it might be of great importance, because if we recall, The flood narrative exists in other cultures, amongst them the closest parallel being the flood narratives found in ancient Mesopotamian culture, both in the early periods and cultures of Mesopotamia, and also in later on in the Akkadian, and in the Epic of Gilgamesh, if we recall, where there's part of the story also includes the account of the flood. We know, according to the story, that the character parallel to Noah, whose name was Utnapishtim, he actually was rewarded for all that he did by getting immortality. Right, he became immortal and becomes a god with Napishtim and his wife. And here, in the biblical perspective on the flood, there's a clear statement. Noah was indeed saved, right? And he was a worthy character, but his conclusion was like all ends of humans' lives, he dies, right? For the Torah, for the Bible, it's a very clear, right, distinction between the divine and the human, right? Where in other cultures that's usually crossed, right? Both in ancient Mesopotamian and also Sumerian culture, as well as later cultures such as Christianity, where there seems to be that the divide is crossed and there's a blending of human and divine. Here, Noah's story concludes with his death. Now, if we want to summarize Noah's life story, I think we can find some interesting parallels between Noah and Adam, the first human. We already saw that a lot of what was commanded to Noah after he leaves the ark parallels what was told to Adam when he was created. Amongst others, what we just read, the command to be fruitful and multiply, in Hebrew, be fruitful and multiply and fill the land. Well, that word for word command was given both to Adam at the end of chapter 1 and to Noah when coming out of the ark in the beginning of chapter 9. And also information about what he may eat, right? And the mention of in the image of God, right? All these parallels, right, immediately bring to mind, right, a clear analogy between Noah and Adam. Now, this analogy, I think, is extended in light of this story, because just like Adam had one son who sinned and was cursed, right? Cain was cursed after he sinned and murdered his brother, right? So too does Noah have one son who sinned and was cursed. Now, in both instances, the Bible recounts that they had three sons, right? There was Cain, Abel, and then Seth for Adam. And here in our story, there were Shem, Japheth, and Ham. So three sons, and one of them being a sinner who was cursed. Furthermore, interestingly enough, the characters themselves both have a certain sin, perform a certain sin, or deteriorate, right? Now, what's interesting is that both Adam's sin and Noah's sin are quite similar in nature because they both involve eating, right? Adam ate from the forbidden fruit, and Noah here deteriorates via his drinking wine and getting drunk and uncovering himself in the tent, right? So both of them kind of deteriorate or fall in light of an action of eating. By the way, the sages even proposed that, I don't think this is a simple reading, right? But that the tree of knowledge was indeed a grape. And I think that's out of that analogy between the two characters that, if Noah deteriorated via drinking wine from the grape, so Adam must have sinned by eating grapes. That was the forbidden fruit, right? That's in the midrashic homiletical interpretation. I don't think it's a simple reading, but it shows you that this interpretation rose from that analogy between those two characters. And like I said, I like to call Noah the second first human, right? In Hebrew, Ha'adam Harishon Hasheni, right? He parallels Adam. But this, of course, raises a question, because if that's the case, and we see that in both instances, the lead central character, the hero, deteriorates via eating, and then there's a son who is cursed, right? By the way, both instances there's an emphasis on nakedness. Adam, eats from the forbidden fruit with Eve, and then they know they are naked. And here, once again, with Noah, he's described as being naked, right, uncovering himself in the tent, right? So there's such great similarities, and of course that leads to the question: oh, if that's the case, and it seems like history is repeating itself once again, the lead character is sinning by eating naked, a curse, one of his sons sins, and there's a curse, right? If that's the case, we can ask, well, how did the flood help and change anything? We're seemingly in a similar route, right? And it seems like nothing has changed. Once again, the opening story of the new world seems to be one of sin. And the answer that I would propose to this statement is, it's true that this story recounts a sin, but is it correct to view the story of Shem, Ham, and Japheth as a story about sin and punishment? Is that the whole picture? Let's remember, there was indeed a sin and a punishment and a curse, but there was also a blessing. In fact, there were two blessings, because two sons did something good. And hence, even though there's still sin in the new world, this is not a perfect world, the world following the flood, far from it, there is still sin. But the difference is that whereas prior to the flood, the description of the world was that it was almost total sin. It was only Noah who was the exception, but all of humanity deteriorated and there was only sin, right? In this new world, while there still is sin, there is a majority of goodness. And in fact, while there still is crime and punishment and there still is a curse upon Canaan, there is a blessing upon Shem and upon Japheth, so that there's a majority of blessing. So maybe there still is sin in the world, but the new world is totally different, because the new world is characterized by a majority of blessing. What has led to that change in relation to the new world? Well, if here we return once again to our story, there's the description of Shem and Japheth's actions. We look in the Hebrew. There's some peculiarity. It's not unique, but there's something odd in the description, because it states Vayikach in verse 23. Vayikach Shem Vayephet. Okay? Now, if we translate it literally, he took, namely Shem and Japheth, right? In the singular. If it would be there are two subjects, Shem and Japheth, but the verb appears only in the singular, Vayikach, right? It should have been Vayikhu, and they took, but it kind of says, and he took, namely Shem and Japheth. And we ask, why is it in the singular if there are two subjects here? It should have been in the plural, right? Now, this is not unique here, and it's found in many places in the Bible where the verb only relates to the immediate subject and not following subjects. But the sages here picked up on this peculiarity, and they found within it significance. Let's take a look once again in Genesis Rabbah, Breshit Rabbah. They pick up on this, and Shem and Japheth took a garment. Rabbi Yochanan said, Shem began the mitzvah, the positive deed, then Japheth came and listened to him. That The singular is purposeful to hint to us that it was initiated, the positive act was initiated by Shem, and then Japheth followed him, right? And hence, if we ask, what's the difference in the new world? The difference is that Shem is able to affect, right, others and bring with him Yefet to create a majority of goodness in the world. We had Ham sinning, we had Shem leading a positive, if you will, rebuttal, and he takes Yefet with him. And perhaps this is the key to the turn in history here, where Shem is able to create a majority by taking a leadership role and causing Yefet to follow him and cover up his father. Okay, so the world indeed has sin involved in it, but the new world has a majority of goodness, and hence we not only have the curse of Ham's son Canaan, but we have the blessing of Shem and Yefet. And indeed, the blessing of Yefet, we recall, was that he will continue to be to lay in the tents of Shem, right? May God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. Like I said, this may be hinting towards a cultural, right, connection between the descendants of Yefet and descendants of Shem. We continue on the next chapter. The next chapter is a list of genealogies. We won't read throughout we won't read the whole chapter with all the lists of the descendants. But if we analyze them, we can see that the three sons, to a large extent, separate geographically into different areas. Let's take a look at just an overview and see if we can identify some of the names. So the chapter begins with the descendants of Japheth, right after the heading. These are the lines of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, sons of Noah. Sons were born to them after the flood. So it actually begins with Japheth, and it states the sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog, Madai, Yavan, Tuval, Meshech, and Tiras. So out of these names, right, those who are familiar with Hebrew would recognize, right, Madai, but also Yavan. Yavan is the modern term for Greece, right, Yavan. And indeed, the descendants of Gomer were Ashkenaz, right? Ashkenaz is a term that's connected with jewelry found in an area of northern France, right? So it might not be the present meaning, but it definitely directs towards the same geographic area. Later on, we see descendants of Yavan included Tarshish, which appears later on in the Bible. It's a place that some locate even towards trade, beyond in the area of the end of Europe, Portugal area, some identified in Turkey. But we're talking about basically the area of the Mediterranean and going northward towards Europe, right? We see from these, the maritime nations branched out, right? These are the descendants of Japheth. Okay, so that's the first one. We can say basically Yavan, that's Greece, and Tarshish, Ashkenaz. The direction seems to be mostly Europe, Mediterranean and Europe. Then we move on in verse 6 to descendants of Ham. The descendants of Ham, Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. Now, Cush is a term used for Africa in general, right? Cush and Ethiopia. Mitzrayim is Egypt, right? And then we have the descendants of Cush include Sva, Havila, right? And then the descendants of Ramah include Sheba, the queen of Sheba. The direction is clear. We are talking about Africa here. Egypt, Cush, Ethiopia, Shva, queen of Sheba, right? The descendants of Ham were found geographically in Africa. And then we continue onwards after all descendants of Ham and Canaan, we continue to Shem in verse 21, right? That's the nature of Genesis, to a large extent, always describing the other sons and then getting to the elected. Shem, of course, being the elected. Of course, from Shem will emanate eventually Abraham, and the Jews, of course, are descended from him, and hence the word used to describe the hating of Jews is anti-Semitism, which is in Hebrew anti-Shemiut, being against the descendants of Shem, right? Semite, Shemite, right? Because this is the lineage, and they emanate from Shem. So he was the blessed, he was the descendants of Shem. And we have a list of Elam. We know Elam was in eastern Mesopotamia, in present day Iran, right? And also Aram, which is further in northern Mesopotamia, right? So it's clear that Shem basically settled in the area of Asia, in the Near East, right, in the Middle East, etc., Mesopotamian area, and eventually expanding. So that if we take the three sons geographically basically present the habitation of the ancient world, which was, of course, split up into those three continents. Europe, the descendants of Japheth, Africa, the descendants of Ham, and Asia, Middle East, the descendants of Shem. We saw a connection, close tie between Shem and the descendants of Japheth that may hint towards later cultural impact. We know that the central religion of Europe eventually was Christianity, which emanated from the Semitic lands and spread from Judaism to Europe. Maybe this is a prophecy that relates to that impact in the long term. Of course, we're talking about a lot later, or perhaps hinting towards closeness of ties between Hellenism and the area of the Middle East, etc. What about the curse of Ham? What's interesting is that, or the curse of Canaan, that he will be a slave to his brothers, to Shem and Japheth. How does that play on later on in history? Well, we know that the majority of slaves, of course, came from Africa, and which is incredible because the story, which places a curse on Canaan, right, who was part of the descendants of Ham, who basically settled in Africa and the land of Canaan, Israel. From here came most of the slaves in history, right? And it's an interesting correlation between this narrative and what plays out later on in history in the late 15th and 16th century. Of course, many of the slaves from Africa were taken to the New World, right? Whether it be to the Americas or to the Caribbeans and many European nations, right? Whether it be Spain or the Portuguese were involved in the slave trade of taking slaves from Africa to the New World through the boats. But the truth is that enslavement of inhabitants of Africa actually began quite well earlier. It's not only the European enslavement, it happened also in the expansion of Arabian culture and the spread of Islam that, of course, settled in North Africa as well, and amongst other things, also enslaved many of and dominated many of the Black Africans in Middle Africa. And this raises the question of the relationship between this story and later history. Right? Some viewed this story as being a source of racism, where the descendants of Cain or Ham that were identified as dwelling in Africa, this attitude led to a racist attitude towards dark-skinned people in Africa. A study was made around this area. You can see here, I'll share it with you on this topic. The title of the book, Study the Curse of Ham, Race and Slavery in Early Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right, by David M. Goldenberg. It's printed by Princeton University Press. Goldenberg was a University of Pennsylvania professor now emeritus. Anyway, you can see the picture here, excuse the picture, but you see the three sons in the tent, etc. Now, Goldenberg wants to understand where the racist attitude emanates from, and he starts with the analysis of the story and the history of interpretation of this story. Now, the story itself doesn't make a clear connection between dark-skinned people and slavery. And Goldenberg goes on to show that in ancient Judaic culture, one doesn't find a racist attitude towards dark-colored skin at all. We recall the Bible itself states that Moses married a Cushite, Isha Cushite, right? So if the highest prophet married a Cushite woman, a dark-skinned, according to some interpretations, all right, woman, it's unlikely that this would be viewed as a racist culture. It was critiqued because of him marrying a non-Jewish foreign woman, but not because of skin color. And in other places, we see the issue of dark-skinned or kusha, description of dark skin, but not carrying any moral evaluation, negative moral evaluation, but rather just as a fact. There's dark-skinned, and that's how they're described. The Goldenberg reaches the conclusion that the connection between dark skin and racist attitude arose in early Christian interpretation, the church fathers, who made the connection between enslavement and dark-skinned descendants of Ham, right? Ham, it's actually the curse of Canaan, right, as we saw, but the title, right, takes on the issue of Ham, whose descendants spread to Africa. You can see in the picture here the two brothers who look away, whereas one is looking at, right? So that's his find, that racism and racist interpretation based off this story is one which developed later interpretation, particularly in the Christian period with the church fathers. But as far as the biblical account itself, it doesn't relate to any skin color, but just is connected to the negative attitude towards the Canaanites, who were considered to be a sinful people. And of course, that we read about later on in Genesis, amongst others, in the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah.